E ngā mana, e ngā reo, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Annabelle McAleer toku ingoa. My name's Annabelle McAleer. I'm the Senior Communications Advisor here at Our Land and Water. Thanks everyone for making the time to participate in our webinar today. We've put together this series of webinars to share research that brings together scientists with farmers, growers, iwi, policymakers, primary industry bodies, businesses and communities to care for our land and water. In the last webinar, last Monday, we shared an interactive map that showed the extent to which nitrogen exceeds current regulations in New Zealand catchments and the likely impact of all known mitigations. We know that degradation of water quality and the land use intensification was enabled by a system that considers all farms separately despite their cumulative effects on water quality. And what we need now is a new collective approach in our solutions. So today we'll be talking about farm environment plans as a practical collective solution that responds to this challenge. In a lot of New Zealand catchments, we know that water quality goals can be met by bringing people who care for and work the land together to design integrated farm environment plans based on shared sub-catchment objectives. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Down the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. We're going to hold all questions until the end of the webinar. We will have about 15 minutes to deal with all your questions at once. By participating in the webinar today, we will add you to our recipient list for our e-newsletter. It just comes out about 6 times a year, and there's an unsubscribe button if you don't want to receive it anymore. Okay, so speaking today, first of all, we have the Our Land and Water Chief Scientist, Rich McDowell. He's just going to give us a really brief recap of some of the information from last week's webinar on how far all known mitigations can get us. And he's going to give a brief overview of the need and characteristics of freshwater farm planning. Then we're going to hear from John Arrell from Farmlands Cooperative. He's part of a newly formed growth and innovation team at Farmlands as head of enabling technology. And he's going to tell us about a collaborative approach that Farmlands is taking to investigate supporting positive actions on farm, and a new report that they've done with Our Land and Water. Then we have Jim Sinner, who's a senior scientist in the Coastal and Freshwater Group at Cawthron Institute and co-leader of the New Models for Collective Responsibility program. Jim's going to talk about a collective approach in our solutions being led by catchment groups to create farm plans that work towards sub-catchment objectives. And finally, Katie Doering, who is science lead of the Register for Land Management Actions program and a freshwater ecologist at Cawthron Institute. Kati will share the results of her farmer interviews describing what motivates and hinders land managers to record and report actions to improve water quality. So, thank you to all of our speakers today. I'm just going to hand straight over to Rich.
Thanks, Annabelle. Okay, so just a recap from last week. It's amazing what you can get with a map where you can swipe left or swipe right to see I guess the size of the problem and also the size, and then importantly the size of the solution. Just letting folk know that the numbers, I guess, that we estimated here were around a 1/3 decrease in total nitrogen and total phosphorus, and about a 2/3 decrease in sediment. But that is assuming that we implement all of our known mitigations, and we do so everywhere. That's a very high bar, obviously, and we especially high if you don't have a plan to do it. And that's where, I guess the government, has taken the lead and mandated, in a world first, the requirement to have what they call a freshwater farm plan, or FWFP. It's amendment of the Resource Management Act, Part 9A, Section 217 F, outlines that a freshwater farm plan must, I guess, remediate impacts on freshwater using clear and measurable actions that demonstrate outcomes. There is, I guess, a promise of money to help do this, but it's incorporating and indeed integrating it with other issues such as climate mitigation, biodiversity, health and safety, animal welfare, even labour. That enables an integrated farm plan that could provide more of a, I guess, a value proposition than just having one focused on freshwater itself. Otherwise, if you had one for every aspect there'd be several utes coming up the driveway that might be turned away. The first stage is really defining what both the process is in terms of implementing this, but also some of the technical and information standards. There's not that much information out there at the moment because that recognises that it's in a developmental stage. There's still planning for the farm plans to be done, and the aim is though that that will be achieved by, I guess, the middle of next year. So, but what makes a good freshwater farm plan? Well, in order to be clear and measurable, they have to be, well, the inference here is that they have to be spatial. For example, knowing where your critical source areas are so that you can put in mitigations, practical ones that are suitable for the location and do so in a very cost-effective manner. Any good plan has to have, I guess, times, well, they have to be time-bound, those actions to be put in place to ensure that you're meeting the priority contaminants, for example, and that they can be done so in a way that meets not only the farm but also the catchment objectives. And to ensure that people are putting the right actions, they have to get the right advice. And so there is, I guess, a move to have those both certified and for those actions, I guess, down the line to be auditable. But we've got capacity and capability constraints. So it's very clear, and indeed, big ups for the industries here in that they have thought about this and they've implemented versions of farm planning. We need to work off those because there are just not the people around at the moment. And I guess finally, looking out 5, 10 years, in order to realise that value proposition, we've also got to encourage and reward practices. But that's not only just on the individual, it can also work as a collective, especially if you're talking farm and catchment objectives. But the first part of that is, I guess, knowing what the problem is. And so this is where I'll hand over to John to give some of his experiences.
Thanks, Rich. I'll just see if I can share my screen here. Yep. So, well, thanks for that introduction there, Annabelle and Rich. So, basically, I want to just cover off why we undertook the project, what farmlands is actually about, why we did it, and then really just give a bit of information on some of the findings and what we actually found out when we went out there to ask the question, and the questions around like why is change hard, why what's the barriers to change, what is the actual feeling on the ground. So to give you an idea, just to start it off, like from farmlands point of view, we have a very, very simple purpose. It's to grow our shareholder success. Because we're a cooperative, our shareholder success directly relates to our success itself. Our mission is to harness the cooperative spirit to be the first for New Zealand's food and fibre input. So it's the power of many coming together to solve the issues that's actually out there at the minute. If we look at, so why are we doing this? Why are we looking into this area? very, very simply, our shareholders' businesses are changing, so we must change. And it's not only from an environmental perspective, it's from the consumer, technology, digital. You know, there's a lot of different areas that are impacting, you know, our shareholders' businesses, farm businesses throughout New Zealand. So, you know, we must then, as a cooperative, supporting the shareholders step up to that. And in order to step up, like we realize within the industry, there's a lot of different initiatives going on to help farmers work through a lot of the challenges that's actually happening on farm. And you know, so where do we actually play? You know, what's our unique advantage? You know, how do we contribute to this? So rather than just jumping in and saying, you know, we'll actually just pick one area, we wanted to fully understand what the problem is. One of the things that we have that we would say is really unique to us is that we're sector agnostic. So we can facilitate land use change. So we're not tied to dairy or horticulture or sheep and beef, you know, so we have the ability then and the technical expertise to go across all those different sectors. So to really delve down into, you know, where do we actually play? What are the actual barriers? Because we all know that change needs to happen. But what are the barriers on the farm and beyond the farm boundary to actually enacting that change? So what we did, we took part in a project over the last number of months, and it's been an interesting journey because the COVID hit in the middle of that, and what we plan to have a in-person workshops and how to take that digital, and but within a good you know, new project or whatever, being able to adapt to change is good. So it was good to really be able to demonstrate that we could adapt to change, and we proved the change is fairly simple. But to give you an idea, the report is online at the minute, but we found a number of barriers, you know, knowledge, capacity, financial barriers, you know, leadership, you know, farmers asking, you know, so I do this, how am I going to be better? You know, what's this going to cost me, and how am I going to be better for doing this? Do I have a sustainable business? So there's a lot of those key findings sort of come out, and I'll just share a story with you where I went out on farm and basically just asked the question, you know, and it was around a lot of the new policies and saying, how do you feel about this? And I was sitting with one farmer, a sheep and beef farmer, and he basically just said, you know, if this is all implemented, I won't have a farm. So the process, like, I just sat there and listened to him, let him express his anxiety, his fear, you know, heard about the negativity within the community, and you know, it was just their livelihoods were being challenged. And one of the things that I realized was, you know, so it was about 1 hour into the conversation. Then I asked him, what does these changes actually mean in a financial sense to you? And he didn't actually know. He wasn't able to quantify them. So being able to quantify change on farm is the first thing. Being able to allow farmers to see that they have a sustainable business in the way forward, and what they can do to actually achieve that sustainability is part of the change process, and then the facilitation of actually doing that. But I think the one big learning I got from the project and taking part in it, it's all farms are different, and in order to change, they need to know what it actually means for them on farm. So following on from that, we're now looking as a cooperative, you know, where do we play in that? What is the key issues around that, and how do we move forward? So that's it from me. I will move on.
Jim, do you want to
Okay.
go next?
Yep.
Thank you very much for that, John.
Let's see, where are we here? No. Ina koutou katoa, ina mana, ina reo, ina maunga, ina awa, ina tangata, ina taonga tuku ihu tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Jim Sinner Tokoinwa, he kaiputayo ko Cawthron Institute in Nelson. So I'm Jim Sinner from Cawthron Institute in Nelson, where I'm a senior scientist and leading a project for our Land and Water National Science Challenge called Fostering Collective Responsibility, or a Maori title is Whakakotahitanga Mo Te Taio. And we're talking today about how catchment groups can improve freshwater health. This project actually has two major work streams. One is called Pa to Plate, and that work stream involves reconnecting consumers with their ancestral landscapes through food from home and supporting growers through a new enterprise called Pa to Plate. And that's pilot of that project is in Northland, where we're working with a number of Maori growers. The talk today is based on the other part, which is about catchment collectives, where we are exploring how can policy incentivize and support groups, catchment groups and sub-catchment groups to achieve freshwater outcomes, including Te Mana o Te Wai. And just want to talk about a little bit of context about past approaches to freshwater management, and recognizing that in the past, freshwater policy and practices have been targeted mainly at individual properties that essentially treat every place, every farm as more or less the same, and in which cumulative effects have not been well managed. This encourages a culture of ticking the box, and ultimately it's rather alienating for the land users and land managers rather than building a community of care. So we think that catchment groups or catchment collectives are a better way of approaching this at least in many situations, and that they have some significant advantages, and particularly they allow some coordination across properties and achieving synergies across properties. It encourages actions that go beyond compliance to thinking about the health of the waterways. And importantly, it helps build trust and community within the land managers, but also with the wider community. This idea is not that new. Collective management has been practiced by communities around the world for centuries to manage and to avoid depleting shared resources such as fisheries, forests, and irrigation systems. And there's now a large body of theory and literature around what are called common pool resources. And it's pretty widely acknowledged that collective management by the users themselves can be better than government regulation, especially when local knowledge is needed to manage the resource, when the locals can actually manage and monitor the resource and each other more effectively than government can, and when social pressure can be an effective way of encouraging people to do what's needed to look after the resource. So today I want to talk about 4 steps that catchment groups might take to improve the health of freshwater, the freshwater bodies in their catchments. And these 4 steps, just to give you an outline, first is focusing on outcomes. Second is preparing a joint plan, partnering with tangata whenua, and then finally monitoring and adapting over time. So taking the first step, focusing on outcomes, talking here about identifying the main environmental objectives within your catchment. That might be swimming, it might be mahinga kai, it might be restoring native fish populations, or some combination of these or others. And importantly, there are a number of attributes and standards set out in the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management in 2020, and in some cases in regional plans that specify what the objectives are for a particular catchment. Beyond this, there may also be local objectives and indicators for sub-catchments. And I think it's important that we get the scale right so that landowners have objectives that are close enough to their property that they can relate to those. So I suggest that sub-catchments should have their own objectives and indicators as well. And that should be based on the wider catchment objectives, but there may be locally specific swimming holes or other things that people care about that it can provide a local objective and indicator. And that may require some discussion between landowners, council staff, Tangata Whenua, and wider communities about locally specific valued places, but also maybe where land use change, if things are, if bigger change is required, then that may require wider conversations as well. I just want to highlight that stories matter. We find that when stories interconnect, when my story has a connection with your story, people are more likely to identify with and to support collective action. People need a narrative and a story they can be proud of. It's really, we're not concerned about freshwater because of nitrogen or sediment or phosphorus or sediment. It's really about the health of the waterways and the creatures that live within them. Most native fish species, for example, in New Zealand are endangered or threatened. And I think that landowners would be proud to be protecting rare species or to keep the local swimming spot safe for everyone. So if people can gather and get commitment around these more tangible outcomes, I think that will help to motivate everyone to play their part. So once we've identified some locally relevant outcomes, then it's a matter of preparing a joint plan at a catchment or sub-catchment scale. Again, first identify the key stressors affecting the outcomes that you've already identified. Prioritize the actions that will make the biggest difference towards those outcomes, and then formalize those in a sub-catchment plan that specifies the location of those key actions. Neighboring landowners can then work together to develop where those actions will be taken, and that can then be included in the individual farm plans that farmers and others will do with their farm advisors. I think that planning like this together is a more efficient way for everyone, and it can accelerate the progress towards those key outcomes if we work together to identify what's going to make the biggest difference at that sub-catchment scale, and then making those the priority within the individual plans. And it may be, for instance, that the sub-catchment planning exercise identifies that a wetland on one farm might make the biggest difference to a healthy waterway. And in that case, other landowners might want to help to instigate and implement that wetland as a way of getting the fastest improvement towards for the waterway. The third thing that I'm recommending is that we partner and that landowners partner with Tangata Whenua. Tangata Whenua have long histories of attachment to these places. They're concerned about the decline of these waterways and in particular about Mehenga Kai. They often are holders of mataranga, of significant local knowledge about these places and the things that have affected them over the decades and centuries in some cases. And they're keen to be involved and to work with farmers and others to make these waterways more healthy. They're in it for the long haul, and in fact, Te Mana o Te Wai, which is an expression of policy intent within the national policy statement, requires councils to work with iwi and hapu, and if we work with them at the local level, that's one way, in my view, of giving expression to Te Mana o Te Wai. So how do we do that? Well, I think we can discuss outcomes and objectives with them at the catchment level, and in some cases at the sub-catchment level, to listen to and understand the history of the land and the people who have been through and traveled across and lived on these in these places, to recognize the sites and species of cultural significance, talk to them about what mataranga, what local knowledge they have about those places, and to explore with them how we can all give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai. I think that if we do all these things, if catchment groups do these things, they'll be in a strong position to demonstrate that they're taking their responsibilities seriously and are in fact implementing a plan of action to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai and the wider national policy statement. And finally, it's important to monitor and adapt. Good things take time. We can't expect that we're going to achieve these things in 1 year, 2 years, probably even 5 years. It may take 10 or 20 years to achieve some of the outcomes that we're looking for. And we need to just monitor that progress over time. I think it's helpful to involve Tangata Whenua in that monitoring. Look for, identify any spikes that might occur in sediment or nutrients or other problems, and then track back that and see where that may have come from. Especially if you're tracking, if you're monitoring regularly, you can maybe see what's causing some of those problems. If indicators aren't tracking as we're hoping them to, then we should review the sub-catchment plan and the associated farm plans and update them so we can reorient them to actions that may make a bigger difference. And if we monitor progress over time, that feedback will give us much more motivation for everyone to play their part, and it hopefully gives farmers and other landowners greater control over their own destiny. They can see they're making progress towards those objectives that everyone has agreed to, and that should give everyone confidence that we'll get there in time. Now, this don't want to suggest that this is all just easy. This is a lot of hard work in here and a lot of questions that's still unresolved about how catchment groups can most effectively work towards these outcomes. So, setting up a catchment group and working together presents a number of challenges, and we're continuing to study these challenges with farming leaders in Tangata Whenua in 4 case study catchments. So just put up on some slides here a few of the questions that we're thinking about. First one is, when are groups ready to set specific measurable outcomes and objectives for their catchments? Some catchment groups are concerned that if they haven't got buy-in from enough of their members, they don't necessarily want to be accountable for objectives that they can't control themselves. So when's the right time to do that? How much action or mitigation is enough? And what role should catchment group members play in monitoring each other's actions? I think if you have clear objectives, that makes it easier to at least think about what action and mitigation might be enough. If you haven't got clear objectives, then it's pretty much, how long is a piece of string? So I think if you can set objectives, it helps them move towards help to answer these other questions. And just a few other questions, what's the best way to support catchment groups without trying to control them or dominate them through funding mechanisms? We want catchment groups to feel as though they're in control and they've got their objectives and working towards those. As I mentioned, how should Tangata Whenua, how do they want to be involved? And where does Te Mana o Te Wai best fit into the overall picture? So those are just a few questions we're exploring through our research, but we think that an overall framework of 4 steps of focusing on outcomes, doing a joint plan, partnering with Tangata Whenua, and then monitoring and adapting over time provides a nice, clear way for catchment groups to think about how they can work together to improve freshwater outcomes. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much. And I'll stop to share. Yeah, good one.
Thank you, Jim. Now, if you could just direct your camera over your shoulder to Kati, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe on Hawaii Whā to the people of All Four Winds of Grigio, kanui na mihi kia koutou ko Kati During, toko ingoa, tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Kati During, and I'll be telling you a little bit today about the interviews I held with local, with land managers around the country. And I thought this Māori proverb, I'll just go back one, sets the scene quite nicely. Toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te whenua. Let the strength of our words strengthen our past, strengthen our land. So I'd like to acknowledge the people that I work with as part of this project. This certainly is not just work done by myself, but in a big group of people. And so let me tell you a little bit about the actions that we do in land and what the issues are. So when it comes to managing our land to improve water quality, there's quite a few things we do, and we're quite good at them. So we plant some plants, and we instigate, we set sediment traps, we build them, we have management grazing strategies, and we put up some fences. And then we also know quite a lot about the water quality within those streams. So we know over 1,500 sites throughout New Zealand whether water quality is improving or declining over the last 10 to 15 years. The thing we're not so good about is quantifying what it is that we're doing. So we don't know the number of sediment traps that have been put in, we don't know the number of trees that have been planted, or the area of land that we retire during winter grazing, and the meters of fencing that we put in, and this especially at a catchment scale. And so what this means is it's really hard for us to link those land management actions to the water quality outcomes. We don't know whether it is the traps that caused water quality to improve, or whether it was the number of trees planted, or whether it was a combination of those actions. So at the end of the day, this really means we're kind of ineffectively managing our land, and for the outcome of better water quality. So we're proposing to set up a national register of actions, where we propose that we start to measure the actions that we do. So we can say at the end of the day, there were 4 sediment traps installed within a catchment, or 200 hectares of land retired, 3,000 trees were planted, and 5 kilometres of fences put up. So really that we're able to identify what actions have been done, where, how much of it, and why. So this fits in nicely with what Richard and Jim talked about, because farm environment plans will become compulsory. So this form of reporting or recording of the actions will become compulsory. So the sooner we kind of up our game on this, the smoother the transition to those farm environment plans will be. So this register that we're trying to set up is, the purpose of it is to record what is currently being done at large scales. We need to keep in mind that we're degrading at catchment scale, so really we need to be restoring at equivalent scales, large scales. But then we also want to make sure that we tell the story and record and report what it is that we're doing. And so we're proposing to do that on a website called LAWA, Land and Water Aotearoa. And what my research really informs how we can record and then report those actions. And that's part of my science communication degree at the University of Otago. So I'll be telling you a little bit about this research now and the results. So when it comes to recording and reporting, we're really moving into the unknown. There's not an awful lot known out there. And I specifically wanted to know what are the barriers of land managers to record and report, what motivates them. And then for those that already do record their actions and report them back, how do they do that? So the best way to find out is to talk to people, and that's what we did. I spoke to 23 land managers within rural communities of 4 cohorts. We did some interviews, semi-quantitative interviews, and we looked at the industry sector, where we spoke to beef and lamb and the dairy NZ sector. We then spoke to farmers from various land use types. We spoke to the community, such as forest and bird, catchment care groups, fish and game, as well as iwi. And then we also spoke to the governmental sector, such as the Department of Conservation, Land Care Trust, and Ministry for the Environment. And so what we found really was, in terms of recording and reporting, the primary challenge there was a lack of recording. So one of my questions was, do you record any of the land management actions you do? And regularly the answer was no, we don't keep track of that. There was an overarching lack of recognition of mātauranga Māori. So one interview said, we have a science department of 90 plus scientists here, and not one of them reports back at a mātauranga from a mātauranga perspective. So that's certainly a challenge. There's this tall poppy syndrome of New Zealanders not wanting to talk about if they've done something well, and in rural communities that's quite predominant. So, you know, yes, we were all doing great things, but why should we go on and tell everyone about it? There was a lack of communication between scientists and implementers. So sometimes the science we do just doesn't seem to reach the people that make change on the ground. And for example, riparian planting, you know, we all suggest we go out and plant trees, but the actual maintenance of those the plantings, you know, it's a huge time factor. So while it's easy enough to plant those trees, you know, we actually need to look after them for the next 5-10 years and do all the weeding. So that's sort of the communication down to ground level. Another one was privacy issues that hinders people to record and report. Obviously, you know, the minute you tell people what you've done, it becomes everyone's business. So the minute someone knows you have a wetland on your farm, all of a sudden everyone wants to know what it is you do to protect this wetland and whether you do anything to protect it. And then there was also the politicization of the further erosion of the social license to operate. This is something that John covered as well. So where they're conscious of sharing something that might just be politicized and further erode the social license to operate. So there were some people, I talked to some land managers that do record, and what I found is that there was no consistency among the recording. So we're talking apples and pears here. So there were different apps that are being used by land managers. Some people report back as part of their financial end of year report, some people as part of specific council, erosion sediment control programs. Some people take a photograph and say, yep, I've recorded what I've done. You can see the plants I've planted. So there's just a whole mix and mingle of ways we do record and then report back. So let's look at what motivates stakeholders. So one theme that came up really strongly was this intergenerational obligation, that we do this for our matariki. We do this to look forward. We can leave something good behind for our future generation. Another one that was a key driver why people want to do this work and are keen to record what they've done is because of the co-benefits. So we put in a wetland and all of a sudden frogs come back, or you can just hear the dawn chorus and birds have started to come back, native birds. So that was sort of a co-benefit. The other one is trust and credibility. So people or land managers are a lot more likely to share what it is that they do if they trust the platform they share it on and trust that the data doesn't get abused. There was societal pressure, which is a motivation. So farmers, you know, wanting to be part of a catchment care group, they don't want to be the outliers, the last ones to do something good on their farm in order to improve water quality. That links nicely in with the engagement of it. So coming together in a community group, also inviting local school children or schools onto your land, and we get together and do good sort of as communities of practice. That really was a key driver why land managers want to record and report their actions. Another one was the economic factor. So for example, we put up some fences and that means we won't lose any more livestock. So that's a co-benefit and an economic benefit. But also because certain councils are very good with funding towards planting and fencing. So that's a driver for them. And then there's the legislation side of things where people do it because they have to through regional plans. So now that we know what are the challenges and how can we foster the good things? How can we keep motivating these people? And freshwater is a really highly sensitive topic. So sensitive topics need to be communicated in a really tactful way. And one of the farmers I spoke with said, man, we just really need to get the story out there. Let's not sit on it. And this is something that Jim talked about as well. And I think it's something we really need to pick up on. It's the stories that we want to share. And there's an author called Frank Rose who's written an amazing book called The Art of Immersion. And he said, the brain detects patterns in information. Stories are recognizable patterns, and in those patterns we find meaning. So the next stage of our project will be to look at how can we share these stories. Let the strength of our words strengthen our past and strengthen our land.
Thanks so much, Kati. That was so interesting. Okay, so we have 20 minutes for Q&A. And we have got some questions through. Thank you very much. Yeah, feel free to submit your questions down below. So we'll just go straight into the first question from Thomas K. Rich, if you could tackle this one, that would be great. A question about the mitigations that, you know, obviously kind of Jim and Kati have been talking about land management actions. is a part of those actions lower stocking rates? He's using the example of the Lincoln University dairy farm, showing that lower stocking rates could lead to increased production and profit. But there's a perception that destocking doesn't seem to be looked at as a mitigation option. Instead, people are looking for silver bullets and expensive things.
Like herd homes, yeah. So that was the question anyway.
And constructed wetlands.
Yeah, okay. Yes, it did, on the basis that there was a mitigation that reduced inputs of N by feed and fertiliser by about half. That would have commensurate effects depending upon the typology, remembering they're all different on stocking rate. I can't remember the exact percentages that would be decreased. What the mitigations didn't do though is account for land use change. And so that's where you could be seeing, I guess, improvements without going down the de-intensification angle.
Jim and Kari, do you have anything to say about that question? Is that when you're talking about measuring land management actions, is measuring a decrease in stocking rate something you're looking at?
Yes, it was something that we will consider as an appropriate indicator for this register that we're looking to set up. So that will be a good one. Yeah.
One last thing to mention on that, you mentioned measuring. I guess next year the challenge will be putting out some advice about where and how to measure, on the basis that our current systems, be they state of environment report sites or others, aren't necessarily geared towards measuring improvements at a property scale. So you could imagine that the signature of those improvements would be diluted the further away you are. So the guidance will cover where to measure, how often to measure, and what to measure with.
Thanks. There's a question for you, Jim. Who are your 4 case study catchments? And the question also asks if there's any link to the MFE exemplar and at-risk catchments, and if you're working with the New Zealand LCET, which I assume is the Land Care Trusts.
Yeah. So yes, our 4 case study catchments are Waitangi in Northland, the Mangaoni catchment in Hawke's Bay, which is a sub-catchment to the Tutaikuri. We have the Pelorus catchment just here between in Marlborough, just around the corner of Nelson, and the Putakino catchment in Southland, which drains into the Jacobs River estuary near Riverton. And the Putakino is one of the at-risk catchments, and the Pelorus is an exemplar catchment with MFE and DOG. So we are working with some of those 4 catchments, and there's overlap with MFE exemplar catchments. And yes, we are working with Land Care Trust. They are a member of our policy advisory group, which we're convening at different intervals during the course of the project and interacting with them over time as well.
Great, thanks, Jim. There's another question for you here from Katrina McIntosh. How do you envisage a collective approach being operationalised logistically and organised to deliver outcomes? For the example, the UK Northern Ireland Water Framework Directive river basin management plans have not delivered the improvement in water quality metrics anticipated in the 15 years that it's been adopted.
Yeah, I think the key is the question of scale, getting the groups organized at the right scale, and this may require maybe nesting of groups where you have a group that oversees the whole catchment, but that at the sub-catchment scale, you've got smaller groups. The Rangitikei has done some of this. I'm not that familiar with how they're organized, but I do know they have sub-catchment groups as well as a full catchment-wide entity that oversees those. And I think that if you have groups organized at a scale that's meaningful to the individual landowners, where they can see that their actions on their property has an effect not very far downstream, and they have got some specific objectives they're working towards at that sub-catchment scale, I think that's much more likely to deliver some material improvement that we're looking for.
Great. Jim and Kari, if you could tackle the next question too, regarding engaging with iwi. So Cherie Johansson says, engaging with iwi is the key to freshwater restoration conversation. Often there's not real collaboration and inclusion of iwi and acknowledgement of mātauranga. What successful stories have you heard of where true iwi collaboration is being done well?
I might jump in. I know that at least within our program, we are actively fostering those conversations. I wouldn't say we can say it's a success yet, but in our research project, we are bringing together the farming leaders with tangata whenua from those 4 case studies into a forum that's going to meet every 6 months for 3 years. And even in the first meeting, we can see some relationships being fostered, good conversations happening, people wanting to work together, and often just getting over those initial inhibitions and getting people talking together is a really important first step. I don't know of any shining examples of success, but I think that getting those conversations started is a really important first step.
Yeah, I might add this from a scientific perspective that we're trying really hard to find common grounds between what many people call the Western science with the Te Ao Māori, the worldview, and the Our Land and Water National Science Challenge has Te Ao Māori as sort of core focus. So we're working as part of my team. There's half of the researchers are from Māori background, and we try really hard to collaborate and work together. It's not always easy because we do come from different backgrounds, but I guess that's all part of the learning curve. And I really personally enjoy learning a lot about the Māori culture. And at the end of the day, a lot of the values and motivations that that came up as part of my interviews, they're common with Pākehā farmers as well. And, the intergenerational relationship, doing this for our children, this is not just specific to iwi. So there's certainly some common themes we can work on together.
I might add one more point, Annabelle, which is that I think that there's a huge potential to work at sub-catchment scale with marae and hapu, which is a different kind of engagement that often happens with iwi at the kind of catchment and even regional council scale. And while that's important at the policy scale, I think that in terms of the real collaboration and inclusion in the tangible stuff that gives expression to Te Mana o Te Wai and Te Kaitiakitanga, I think that working lower down at the hapu and marae and whānau level is ultimately going to be much more satisfying. That's my perspective as a Pākehā, and I can only that's one of the things we'll be exploring in our research. But I think there's huge potential if we can bring those conversations down to the more local level.
I've got a question actually. So some land managers, they might have never engaged with tangata whenua before, and they might have a bit of a fear of doing something wrong. We're really bad at teaching tikanga in schools in New Zealand. So who should support them? Do you have a sense of where that responsibility lies? Is it the industry body groups or regional councils or somewhere else?
I think it can come from a variety of sources. I suppose ultimately regional councils have some formal responsibility to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai, and so they could help to foster some of these conversations. But it doesn't need to rest there. Industry could do that. Land Care Trust could help bring these conversations together. But I agree with you. There is some reluctance or concern, or maybe even inhibitions in not knowing what that conversation may look like or what may happen. But in my experience, they've all been positive. And I think if people just make the effort and get to know each other, good things will happen.
Thank you. Next question. We've got a great question here from Rebecca Campbell. She's directed it at Kati, but John, I think you probably have some insights to offer as well. With different stakeholders and different land use types, did you find big differences between land uses in respect to barriers and motivators? Do you think it would be difficult Kati, for you, for the Land Management Action Register to take these differences into account?
John, do you want to start? Because I don't, and then I chip in towards the end, just because we haven't heard from you for a while.
John, you need to unmute yourself. Yeah, in your going out on farm, did you notice a difference between land uses and farm systems?
I wouldn't say there's much a difference in land use and farm systems. The barriers have changed. I think one of the big learnings was the people. You know, we came across very progressive farmers, you know, where we're already taking the initiative, who were looking at, you know, where their business will be in 5, 10, 15 years time, and putting plans in place. And it wasn't sector specific. I think everything came down to the people, the ability of the resilience, just of being able to look at challenges, work their way through it. And so it was no particular land use or no particular sector in the industry that stood out more than any other. You know, so I'm coming from a product sort of background, and you sort of describe it as a bell curve, you know, your product adoption curve, where the innovators and the early adopters, you know, will get on board first, and then it's, you know, what help do the rest of the population actually need to start to get onto that journey. So I hope that answers it. So yeah. I'm really coming from it from a general perspective.
I found similar patterns. I mean, there was no difference between land use types, because if the objective is to restore ecosystem health or water quality, it didn't necessarily matter whether it is a sheep and beef farmer or a dairy farmer. It was the same goal they had. So there were no specific motivations that particularly spoke to dairy farmers that didn't speak to sheep and beef. The way they go about achieving that'll be different. But in terms of motivation barriers, we didn't find much differences.
Rich, a question for you from Adrian Broxop. Will the timelines for working collectively at a catchment level be able to align with the timelines that are being set at a national level? And do you feel the government will be willing to push out expectations of timelines to allow sub-catchment collaboration to effectively take place?
Sure. So I guess the best way to answer this is to reiterate what the government has told us in terms of their aims to improve water quality within a generation, but then also you know, subtext within that is to show some sort of measurable change within 5 years. Now that's obviously going to be quite difficult, and it'll be difficult around the country because of the way that our catchments respond, and that includes our people and the way that they're going to implement their changes. Take, for example, a lag time between putting in an action and detecting it could mean that, you know, within 5 years you've still got water quality deteriorating, but even though people have put in actions. However, I guess that instills the need and also the importance of both good recording, as Kati was saying, and also of freshwater farm plans as the sort of canary in the coal mine, so that we can kind of celebrate success on a time scale that not necessarily we're comfortable with, but that we can control.
Thanks, Rich. We are nearly at the end of our time. We've got quite a few more questions. I don't think we're going to be able to get to them all. There's just, for the people who are watching this at a later date on video who won't be able to see all these questions, I just want to read out a comment from Kepa Morgan that related to what we were talking about earlier with iwi engagement, because it's a really good comment and it would be great to make it available. He says, iwi and hapu are most concerned with how genuine the relationship is and the intentions of forming it. So he suggests that people enroll in online Māori language classes as tikanga customary practices come with language understanding. Online websites can be used also, but it's best to visit local marae and establish a relationship that is not outcome driven, but that will allow you to get to know who with and when to raise issues that concern you and ask what the priorities for iwi and hapu are. So really great to hear that from you. Thanks, Kepa. Right, well, maybe one more question from Aslan Wright Stowe. This is a question for you, Kati. What do you see the role of regional councils in providing data for the Register of Actions project? Councils have supported significant restoration work, which will ideally be captured. And how do you deal, another question, how do you deal with data privacy issues for landowners?
Yeah, kia ora, Aslan. Yes, so many councils do have long-term monitoring plans in place, such as the Taranaki Regional Council with their riparian management plan, and they've been collecting data for a long time now. So, and they are sort of the councils we will target to give us the data or provide us with some of the data, keeping in mind that we will need to deal with the privacy issue here. So at the minute we're contemplating to treat it like they do for census, so we won't give away information at a property scale. It'll be, the data we collect will be a lot more finer and detailed than what we intend to share, so we'll be sharing at a sort of summary statistics at a catchment scale. That way, kind of cautiously treating those privacy issues, making sure we don't turn this tool into a compliance tool. That's certainly not something we want to do, but we're well aware that that's a threat out there. So that's how we tend to deal with it. But this is something we will look into this year more specifically. And in terms of the other data providers, maybe briefly, we are talking with national organisations such as Dairy NZ to provide us with, such as yourself, with data.
Great, thank you. Okay, that's all the questions we have time for today. So thanks everyone for coming along. Thanks for your time. We hope you've enjoyed the webinar. I'm just going to share screen about where you can go to for more information. There we go. Right, so in webinar 2 last week, we spoke about the evidence that mitigations have been working and that in many catchments, accelerating this work will allow water quality expectations to be met. So today we aim to show how a collective and more supportive approach to land management is needed to provide this acceleration. And hopefully we've shared why it seems like this is going to be more effective and more motivating than individual approaches. Our final webinar next Monday at noon deals with the fact that 100% of farmers adopting 100% of all mitigations is a stretch, and for some catchments and on some farms, looking at changing the intensity of production or use of some land is a more pragmatic solution than applying all mitigations. So yes, you can find the information on next Monday's webinar. That address on screen, ourlandandwater.nz/events. We hope you'll join us. So thanks for coming along to the webinar. Thanks, John, Jim, and Kati for sharing your work, and have a great week.
Okay.
Okay.